this wonderful exhibition by Thea Weiss. I'm very honoured that Thea has asked me to. I think we're doing an in conversation. I don't know if I talk for a living at the moment. So as a lecturer at Western Sydney University, but Thea and I have been friends for a long time, 10 years, and Thea is a highly skilled and talented artist, and she came to me at Willoughby Workshop Arts Centre. Really, one of the things I've taught art and design for a lot of my life, and but for a fully formed artist to come to me to say I need some help. So our relationship really has been one of, I suppose, mutual mentorship. I feel that very much. And what I thought we'd do today, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the importance of artists, just to start with. And I had a very weird experience yesterday. Two designers came to me and said that they wanted to start a website where they took images by artists and then redesigned them and sold them really cheaply. And they wanted me to think about that conceptually and how I might be able to help them.
Oh my.
And it kind of blew my mind. And I was thinking, and I had been thinking about what I would talk today, mention today, and I thought, that was such a weird thing to ask an artist. And they said, I hope I don't offend you. And I said, no, you don't offend me, it just depresses me a little bit. Because one of the things that I think as human beings that we're all looking for is some form of real meaning. And the visual arts, and I often, when I talk to students of mine, one of the things that they say, how do you define that feeling you get, that good feeling you get when you're painting or creating things? And Thea's smiling, I think she knows what I mean. There's this unquantifiable sensation of when your mind and your body are connecting to try and create something. And it's embodied in this work here today. So that idea that you can commodify, or artists often try and sell their work to make a living, but the idea of taking something and turning it into a homeware and a product and selling a version of art cheaply it really did blow my mind. So the idea here today that I wanted to talk about is, I suppose, and which is very much what Thea does, is her work to me is about memory, and it's about the threads in her life reaching right back to childhood, and the idea of storytelling. And I think in terms of our culture and visual culture and the importance of human culture is the ability for art to tell stories in different ways. I'm very interested in art science projects and ideas around planetary health and the work that I do at the university. And one of the things is I try and, like Thea does, is tell stories through the work that I do and artists that I work with, to actually depoliticise, demystify, unveil different ways of looking at things. And I think that's what artists do. They give us a chance to maybe stop and reflect, and through time, because one of the things about Thea's work, I know we've got Ben Rake here, who's a printmaker. Printmaking is, and there's a lot of print work in this show, is about taking time, using materials, layered ideas, coming back, reworking things, seeing what it looks like, then reworking again. So that idea of sort of striving for something that is often quite ephemeral, which is what art is in lots of ways. But then coming to some form of resolution that is, I suppose, I like to think about art and design in terms of we ask certain questions about things that we're thinking about and want to explore, like particularly stuff related to your family that's really, really personal. And then ask a series of questions. You get to a resolution, which is an artwork, which is actually just another leaping off point for another question for the next body of work. So for me, it's really wonderful to see, you know, over many years, Thea's work evolve, and sort of come back to these themes of gloves and things that your mother has worn and that you've repurposed for us to think about in you know, the highly personal work. So that's kind of a rambling, you know, beginning point for us to start to talk about. The other thing I would say is, I suppose this year has been extraordinary, and to be surrounded by work that's celebrating, you know, your mother and your family, and you know, we've all had, I suppose, connections to people who've experienced COVID in a different way. I think we're actually at a point where we really do need to start reflecting more on the way we've been living and human culture, and I think art is actually a great way to stop, think, and look at different ways of thinking. So now, this is going to be sort of an in-conversation, but I want you to work, and I want Thea to work, and I'm just going to try and pick up threads and build on those. So maybe I'd like to ask Thea to say a few things about her work. I know most artists really hate talking about their own work, and because it is quite difficult. It is highly personal. You know, that idea of working in the studio on your own is actually the safe space. This is the unsafe space for most artists. You know, it's really nice to get recognition, public recognition for your work, but it is also, I feel for Thea, because I'm not comfortable talking about my own work as well. So, Thea.
Thank you everyone for coming. Leo speaks much better than I'm able to, and I like my work to do the talking. So that's why I'm telling my mother's story my mother's almost 97 and hasn't been well. I was meant to have this exhibition last year, and she was very, very ill. So that's why it's a life regifted, that she's able to still be with us. And I'm very lucky. But over the years, she's told me the stories, written them down on the envelopes, and that's why I use envelopes. But a lot of the work I've done is in a very personal way to show my mother's story without it being as obvious as possibly other ways of telling it. And my mother often says, why don't I just paint flowers? And to me, you know, I need to have a reason why I do everything. So every material I use, there's a reason why I've used it, and it reflects back onto the work.
Okay. So maybe, what about we open this up for a few questions, because I know there was a few questions being asked down the front before. So is anyone, is there anything that you would like to know about? One of the things that, Thea, I know a little bit about art theory, but Thea doesn't like to talk about art theory. But, you know, I like Thea, grew up with this idea of modernism, the grid, which a lot of these works have formal qualities, and that crossover between, I suppose, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and we kind of moved into more urban living and ideas of steam engines and technology taking over, and the printing and advertising. And so a lot of the works with the text in them, you know, feel to me like that great American artist Jim Dine. There's a sense of that. There's a lot of different threads running through this work, but those formal qualities, and I think are really, really beautiful in this.
I think I started with the grid because in 2006 I was doing my bachelor's at the National Art School, and the final project was you had to use the grid.
Yep.
And that's how it started with it. But in Judaism, gematria is the study of numbers, and what every number means something. So that's why I started doing it in a grid as well, so that the number means something in Judaism.
So, and the other thing about this work is, so my work is, I suppose, a hybrid of it's a European painting tradition. This work is the idea of flattening the picture plane, so more graphic nature, so less illusionistic, where you can travel into the work. So this is, you know, so that's the kind of modernist aesthetic that informs this work. But yeah, so.
Well, I use envelopes because my mother writes everything on an envelope, her shopping list, and she's writing, she makes, for our two granddaughters, she makes birthday books every year, and she writes the verses on the birthday books. So whatever it is she writes, and then I take the envelopes and shellac them, and then I use encaustic, which is wax. Hot wax, I melt beeswax and daymar, which is the resin from a tree, and then paint that on, and then you fuse it with a heat gun, so that every time I paint, put on another layer, another color, it's fused. So that's making something permanent. So that's why I've used envelopes. When I use the wafer board, which is the wood, wafer board is usually used for travel or for shipping. And because my mother has traveled so much, she went to China in 1948. She was there the last year before the communists came in. And so, again, that's why with wax, again, using that. Using sewing because and buttons. My mother's father was a tailor, and he had the ability just to look at a pattern and recreate it without, looking at a garment without a pattern and recreating it. And my mother also made her own clothes, so that's why I use sewing and text in my work. And say Jim Dine, the artist Christopher Wool uses stencils and run-on. So I think that was how I started looking at having, so that there's the writing and you could read it, but not, you don't want to, be able to read everything. And so with the jacket, it's there. And to me, it's always, there's palimpsest where there's an underlying story without it being so obvious.
So embedding
Yes.
the ideas and relationship with your mother, the things that she's written down.
Yes.
Within the work, which also crosses over with the idea of printmaking.
Yes. Yes.
Your mother's obviously your muse and inspiration, and you mentioned that it's her stories
Yes.
that you build on and
Yes.
convey. But I'm wondering, how does that exercise and engagement inform your own self-awareness and your own self-creativity, reflecting on someone else's stories, albeit your mother?
I'm an only child, brought up just really by my mother. So I think that we were really meshed. So, I always imagine, because I'm so similar to my mother, that a child is like her mother. And so, I don't know about, my other work is on my mother-in-law, who's a Holocaust survivor. So even when I do my own work, or I do landscape, I'm still incorporating envelopes, or still incorporating text. I think it's so ingrained in me now that I want everything I do to tell a story. So it's my background, or a family member's background, rather than just a straight landscape, as Leo does the most wonderful landscapes, but mine are totally with my bent on using my materials. Sorry, did that help? Sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask, memory is a funny thing, and are you here reproducing your memory, or were you consulting with your mother to make sure that your memory meshed with her?
She wrote all her stories down many times on many scraps of paper, and it was hard because I would try to see which paper went with something else. So I'm interpreting her story, and just her poor background and all the unhappiness that she shared. Even though I was so lucky, I had a wonderful upbringing and never felt any of that. It's only later on, it's only recently where all of her stories, where she wrote them, started writing them down.
You mentioned that so this is about your mother, but you also work about your mother-in-law.
Yes.
So there's this focus on motherness.
Yes.
And I wonder how if it's gotten you to sort of reconsider your role as a mother, first of all. And so you're taking your previous generation's stories and you're retelling them to keep them alive.
That's right.
And so I wonder if you have any room for your stories in there for the next generation.
Yes, that's an excellent question.
Have you thought about how this is reflecting on your children?
No, I've always put my children first because I was put first. So that went without saying that whatever I had, my children would have also. But as far as telling my own story, I guess I'm lost if I'm not telling somebody else's story because I'm so accustomed now to being a repository of other people's stories and just representing it in my own way that I haven't gotten to that stage. I guess when I finish eventually, then I'll say, who am I?
Yeah, can I pick up on that? Because I think all those three questions are quite interconnected in a way.
Yeah.
And I think artists, and I think this as humans, we pick up on those foremost experiences of childhood. And if you're going to make art that's personal and narrative-based, those kind of foremost experiences really inform what you do. I know with my own work, my mother, who's very unwell at the moment, a couple of years ago gave me back some paintings that I did when I was about 10, about 40 that she'd saved. And I was showing my son, who's also at art school, who's going, oh, these aren't so bad, but he said, you're still painting the same old crap, Dad. But the landscapes that I started painting from then are still relevant to me today, I suppose. And I think with, your mother and your mother-in-law's stories are intrinsically part of your own story.
Yes. But I was originally my first life, I was a fashion illustrator from New York, trained in Parsons School of Design. So that's a totally different mindset. And when I started the National Art School, I would be told an illustrator is not an artist. So you can't, paint the way you did. So you can't be who you are. So I had to be somebody else and, pretty malleable. So if someone said, be something else, I was something else. So I think that's how it started. But I wasn't allowed to be. I didn't have enough confidence, I guess.
But if anyone doesn't know, the Parsons School of Design is probably the premier design school in the world. So, you skipped over that quite lightly. But in terms of as an institution, it is highly regarded. For graduates.
But when I came to Australia, so for 20 years I was an illustrator in Israel, in Argentina, and New Zealand, and New York, and I came here, and there was no fashion illustration. So I couldn't believe it. That was part of me, and I never thought it would not continue. So I started doing calligraphy. I started making children's paintings, and then I went to Willoughby and I did lithography and painting, and I started seeing, well, I like doing my art again, and not working for my husband.
Slave drive.
And that's how it started. Yes, Margaret.
I really like how the sculpture when you used the word mesh just earlier, I immediately looked at the sculptures behind. It was wire and mesh.
Yes.
And you're fusing your stories with your mother. I mean, can you just comment?
Yeah,
on
sure.
that?
My mother is so tiny. She weighs 35.7 kilos, but she's always had this body dysphoria where she imagines she's much bigger than she is. And so that was taking a mannequin and taking chicken wire, because my mother used to raise chickens, and just doing different forms with it, and taking her envelopes and using the same caustic soda. A lot of my prints are caustic soda on lino, so instead of carving out lino, I burned the surface. So I printed those and then wove it through as if I was sewing, since I use sewing in my work. The jacket, the hats, the gloves, and the form, I sewed the story and then put it on zinc plates and run it through the press and then etch that. So that was totally different, but because I used sewing, that to me was how I could use sewing in the work, and that's how I started with the wire. And with the heads, because my mother is super intelligent and has many degrees. She went back for a second master's at age 70. But I took, again, with the encaustic that I use in my paintings, and then used the different materials, again relating back to the buttons or the letters or the wire and the envelopes. So again, having it to represent how I view her, what she thinks about herself.
Thank you.
What is her reaction to some of these things?
I think it's a bit too modern, and she can't understand, because my mother is an artist, but does more commercial over the years. I mean, in the 40s, she used to draw and write for different magazines in New York, so she's much more traditional. So she finds it interesting.
Interesting. It can be one of those things.
Yes. Yes.
There's in some of the pieces anyway. You've actually taken an art form that already existed that your mother produced. The written word.
Yes.
There might be a bit of family history there. There might be a bit of fiction, certainly literature. I hope you made copies of her letters before putting them
Oh no, these are not letters. These are just her shopping lists and her things. But
even in that, so it's interesting how you've taken an existing art form, and let's face it, the art of putting pen to paper, even if it's just a mere shopping list on an envelope, is a dying art in itself.
Yes, right.
But you've to use the word earlier, repurposed that art form into a visual art form. And is that a conscious thing that you've done, knowing that, or you're just a visual person, and so the retaining of the bits of paper that your mother wrote on for future generations was not something that you thought of? That
for her own, when she writes, then I keep everything. And in fact, when she moved out of her house and into an apartment, I saved all of her original art. I have all of her artwork over the years, and she was a teacher for so many years, and all the wonderful letters that the principals and her students wrote. So all of that I keep. But this I'm not, so it's shopping list I'm not attached to.
Well, one of the works that sorry.
Yes.
I was going, which is your favourite method of expressing yourself? Which is your favourite?
When I was at National Art School and someone came in to critique my work and said, every work is different. There's nothing the same, and he was very critical of that. And so then I made 6 paintings that were exactly the same, but that's not how I think, and that's not how I work. And I do something, so then I would have made prints, and then I thought I want to make, because it's taking apart, it's the figure, and deconstructing it by printing it on the my mother's envelopes on graph paper, on canvas, on aluminum, and that was taking it apart, and then this was again taking the same and taking it apart again, and then I'll make paintings. So I go from, and then I make the painting, and then I make the sculpture. So I don't go
Linear.
no. Something informs something else.
Yeah, I might pick up on that actually. You know, as a painter, I have a blank space, I get paint and I work directly onto it, and it's very immediate. One of the things, and Thea's got paintings here, but even those ones have got layers
Yes.
and layers in them, and so even though she does paint, she paints the way a printmaker would work, which is in stages, and you have to wait in between, and so work evolves. So the material quality and the physicality of making plates, the way the ink's applied, the thickness of the ink, and how it comes out. And many of these are one-offs.
I prefer working one-off.
Yeah.
I get pleasure from thinking about it, making the plate, doing the print, and moving on.
Yeah.
So, even with the jacket, when I made the jacket, there were several versions of the jacket. Many were sold previously, but it's very rare that, unlike Ben, who can make multiples of 50, I don't. It never looks the same twice. So I don't enjoy making. To me, it's more creative. Even if I'm reprinting, so if I'm printing like this one, where I'm printing the figure, then I printed it that way, and I'll print it that way, and I printed it different ways on different materials. So I much enjoy it, and then I'm ready to do something else.
Are you ever satisfied with absolutely satisfied with the final? You wouldn't change it? You wouldn't?
So I can say right now that that's fine, and then when I go back and I look over, often I paint on top of it because I say, it's no matter. Sometimes I painted 2 or 3 paintings on top, and I say no, it's never going to be. But at the stage when I've completed it, it's what I wanted. But later on, then I could go back and then do something on top.
And I also say to that is actually, when I went to art school many years ago, there's this push for young artists to go and get a gallery and have a career and do all that. One lecturer said to me, enjoy the journey of being an artist and don't worry about anything else. And actually, and I didn't take that advice initially, but I've since started to take that advice. But it is actually, being an artist is not kind of a lifestyle choice. It's something that you live, and that's why that search for meaning, that the importance of creativity in your life, the constant questioning. And there's also a period where you're making the work, it feels fantastic, you finish it, there's a kind of sense of satisfaction, you start making new work, and then you look at your old work and you're kind of moved on, and so it's this kind of constant evolution, and that's that journey. And
I think it's having something to say, and then I've said it, and then I put it in the drawer, and so no one may ever see it, but I knew that was what I wanted to say at the time, and the way I wanted to say it, and then maybe sometime I'll take it out again, but that was, yes. And I think I'm at the stage, almost 70, where I can do what I want, and not have to worry. I'm not a young one, and I can't, talk in theory, and I can't be a certain way, and I say, this is who I am, and I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and I feel I'm having a purpose.
any other questions?
Yeah, just one.
You sure?
Yeah, just the creative process for you. What's the ideal environment where you just feel the creative juices are flowing?
It comes in the middle of the night, I think, and I'll suddenly think that I see something, and I think, yes, that's what I want to do. That it's very hard. It just suddenly comes, and it's, as Leo was saying earlier, you're in a zone, and often I think, how did I make that? and I have no idea because you're so involved in it and suddenly it's there and suddenly it's happened and I wouldn't be able to do it again because that feeling of creativity or that what I wanted to say came out and it's gone.
And yeah, sorry.
I was just going to ask if you've done your mother-in-law's stories and now you've done your mother's stories. And you say you're not ready yet to do your own
I
stories.
have done portraits. I've done many portraits, yes, but
I was going to ask what is the next big project that you're going to embark on?
I love looking at trees and the bark of trees. So I think I've done that previously, and then I've done several, and then I come back and I do this. But I have started. But doing trees, making etchings of trees and paintings of trees. But again, incorporating the same materials and the same way and the same process, the same thought process, but not necessary, but not something with a family.
Well, it's going to be an endless variety for you there, isn't it?
Trees, yeah.
Yes, I love the trees in Centennial Park.
I think also one of the things with landscape and art in general, visual arts, is observation. Observation is really important. You know, I teach absolute beginners to, you know, the first thing I get them to paint is clouds, and then they come back the next week and then they go, I can't stop looking at the clouds. And so the one thing about artists is they often notice the things that other people might walk past, and they bring that into their work, you know, or focus in on a micro way in terms of something like bark, and then see where you could take that. So this whole idea of exploration. And I know with Thea's work, seeing how different phases of it are overlapping, and she's thinking her way through it. It's sometimes when you're in it, it's a little bit like soup. And then you have that time for reflection when you've finished a body of work, such as this, that you can actually see more clearly where you've been and then where you might go.
It's interesting because at Parsons, when fashion illustration, you didn't use photography, and all the newspapers all the department stores, there were so many in the 60s that advertised in the New York Times. Each department store had its own illustrator, and it gave the personality of the store. So Von Teller had someone, and Saks Fifth Avenue had somebody, and you could recognize the store through the art. And you were taught, even though a person maybe 7 heads, an illustration was 10 heads, you had to look how many stitching, because there wasn't photography, and it became later where there's photography and someone is swirling, and it's the ambiance that you may not even be able to see, and you look at fashion magazines now where you can't actually see the clothing, but it's the feeling of the clothing makes you, if you buy the clothing, you'll be running through the fields. But I had to illustrate every stitch and how many buttons, and it became really important. So you learn for those details that, and one of my illustrators used to say, every line matters, and think before you put down a line. So, and it stays with me, that rather than anything extraneous, even though that may not be contemporary art where it's many lines, that's for me, that to really think. Yes.
Because you mentioned that when you went to the National Art School, they told you have to forget about that idea of the illustration, but here we are, I don't know how many years later and how many more years into your practice, and the influence of fashion is clearly there. All the work is in some way or another related to fashion, like you say, the use of buttons and gloves and stitching and mannequins and busts and all that. So
I hadn't thought about that. That's very interesting.
It's very clearly
how
your
interesting.
work.
Yes.
And so
That's very nice. Thank you. I hadn't even thought of it in that connection. It was more the method of how I was putting down, how I was using paint or how I was using drawing, that was discouraged.
I think it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, and this sort of idea of you're telling someone else's stories, but they're all completely within your framework, within your way of
very nicely said.
visualizing things.
Thank you.
Yes.
Your work seems to straddle, both in your life and its development, what I might call the craft, as distinct from perhaps ideas of art, but they've always been quite sort of divided. I'm just wondering, from your point of view, having straddled creatively across what seems to me craft and art, you know, what your reflections are on that distinction between the two and the creative process involved in either or both. I mean, do you see them as different?
I
Do you
don't think-
handle them differently, or?
No, I don't think that you could say somebody's craft is not an art. I don't know. What would you say?
I think in
A formal sense?
I think when I was at art school, say 30 or 40 years ago, to talk about craft and fine art in the same, it was just horrific. You just wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
But I think the game has changed. The material quality of craft is now firmly crossed into fine art, and I think if we look at the way technology has revolutionised how we're just constantly bombarded by images. So, you know, someone in 1850 would see the same amount of images that you would see in a day in their lifetime. So, no, the other way around. But yeah, so I think it's totally changed the way we view images. And you look at the crossover between, if you look at the work of someone like Del Catherine Barton, her work is illustration. It's painting, but it's illustration. So you've got this kind of these hybrids happening. So yeah, I think it doesn't. I think people are kind of just looking at the world in a different way now. Yeah. Without the politics of craft or art or yeah. Did that answer?
Did you think so? I thought that answered.
Do I think so?
Yeah. I don't know. I think when
Do you think
you
it was answered?
I think that's a fair enough response. Yes.
We
It's a big
do
topic.
hear from friends who are down at that very community level with, you know, the local village shop, that there's still a quite sharp divide between those who say they're doing art and those who say they're doing craft.
Okay, yeah, well that's a kind of, so if you look at, so there's artists like Glenn Barclay, who was the director, the curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art. He's doing ceramics now using images from 1830s. He's using craft-based ideas, but making kind of almost anti-art statements with them, but trying to sort of position it as high art. So there's, yeah, no, I can sort of see what you're saying. There is, you know, I'm from the Blue Mountains, and there's a kind of a genre of local art that's made, stained glass, gum nuts, that whole sort of type of ceramic work. And I think it's probably the difference between art and craft is the intention in which you use those kind of, you can bring in, say, like long stitch into making a sort of an artwork in a gallery, because you're kind of almost, I suppose, inviting that craft notion into that space to be looked in a different way. Yeah. That is there is politics there.
And it has been for centuries.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting subject to explore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure.